Happy Monday afternoon, everybody. We are currently getting ready to start the non-STEM and STEM research computing, expanding research creativity and scope HPC focused panel. The panel schedule for the day is going to run like this. We're having our introduction right now. Then we'll have the panelists do their presentations. At that point, we'll open up the floor for questions and answers from the audience. And then we have a 2-slide closing remark about resources and support that are available to you, your friends, and anyone who might want them for free. So as we go through this, please go ahead and keep questions into the chat. We'll go ahead and address those in the order that they came in once all of the panelists have gotten a chance to speak. After the panelists have spoken, you're also welcome to raise your hand and ask your questions verbally if you wish, but we'll be monitoring both of those. With that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all very much for joining us today. This panel is designed to get people interested and thinking about their research potentially in a different way than they have in the past, right? Oftentimes we find ourselves limited by the resources we have at hand, and those may, without us realizing, change the questions that we ask when it comes to research. My personal background is as a plant geneticist, and I know that when I stopped thinking about the things that my laptop, of all computers, was able to handle and started accessing these large supercomputer resources, the questions I was able to answer changed in scope dramatically. So we'll go ahead and start off the panel with NMSU's very own Ali Hyder, who is a PhD student in astronomy. Ali?
Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Ali Hyder. I'm a 4th-year graduate student at New Mexico State University. And I've been working at the astronomy department for a little while and working with high-powered computing for, I think, longer than that. And I wanted to give a little bit of a background into what HPC actually is and how it's being used at NMSU Astronomy. So, okay, so what exactly is high-powered computing? So plenty of experts here can and will talk about it in the coming presentations. But to just give, preface this entire event, I suppose, HPC is basically, high-powered computing that enables large-scale problems to be solved far more efficiently. Typically, problems in the modern world aren't as simple as, all right, let's solve for X, which we're all familiar with, and we know how to do from just analytical mathematics from high school. Generally, modern problems are not that simple. They require typically nonlinear differential equations that may or may not be coupled. And what that means is that you're looking at very, very small changes over small time scales and small length scales. And generally, these evolve in very complicated nonlinear ways. So HPC is the way that we sort of numerically approximate these solutions, because typically these don't have simple solutions or analytical closed forms. We generally have to approximate them in one way or another. And these problems typically span a whole slew of disciplines. So we heard of plant genetics. That's also true for climate studies, astronomy, molecular dynamics, engineering, everything. Modern economic models, artificial intelligence, all use high-powered computing. The entire foundation of the digital infrastructure is laid by such supercomputers. Okay, so exactly what is it? It's basically making your computer work like a commune, effectively. So you have differences in parallel computing and serial computing. So HPC is basically something that uses parallelized computing. And typically what we're familiar with, and most people here would be familiar with, is serial computing, that you have a task and that task is computed one by one, as it's parsed through the computer, and one computer solves it. Now, things that are a bit more complicated, generally modern computers have their own separate little cores, but let's just assume it's a single core. What high-powered computing is basically breaking up the problem in independent parts and then computing them simultaneously. That's all that it is. It's easier said than done, but that's the gist of it. And these cores basically evolve whatever model that you're looking at together, and they combine it together. So there are complications with, computation and communication. And with that, I mean, we're getting more into the weeds of it, but like that's in general the idea. So before we get into what's being done at NMSU Astronomy, I want to just highlight one of the biggest turbulence models that's ever been performed using high-powered computing. This was done using the Gauss Center for Supercomputing. And turbulence is an inherently nonlinear problem, and modern fluid dynamics deals with it all the time. And so generally dynamicists use high-powered computing to understand the intricacies of how fluids behave at a very small level over longer time scales and all of that. This particular simulation looked at basically the sonic scale, where, like you have things operating close to the sound speed, like right above it and right below it, and that threshold. And this used 65,536 cores. You can think of this as like that many computers. In total, it resulted in 45 million core hours. Now, that's not something that a single computer can do. If you do that, it will require thousands of years. So this is a good example of like the scalability and the types of questions that we can ask when using high-powered computing. This is completely intangible and completely non-feasible with a single computer or even just a few computers. You really need to get to very, very high level, high-powered computing to understand something like this. And they were able to really, capture some very specific novel behavior, such as like density structures that exist at sort of the forefront of the sort of front of strong shocks. And this, understanding of fluid mechanics came from high-powered computing. This would not be computable in any, simplified system. Okay, so let's get a little local. Let's talk about NMSU Astronomy. So this is the stuff that I've been working on. I'll just run these models in the back. So I've used the NMSU, well, I've also used the Discovery cluster, but I've also used Stampede at TAC here to generate these models. And these are looking at, sort of the overall evolution of Jupiter over 20,000 Earth days at a very small resolution, at a very high resolution and very small length scales. Like each pixel is effectively only 70 kilometers across on the planet. To put that in perspective, Jupiter's size scale is 71,000 kilometers in radius. So this is a very high resolution model. And high-powered computing is what's enabling this type of study. And we're able to see the different dynamics take place using different parameterization. So this gets at, the overall scope of the project as well. And that's going to be sort of bolstered by the next slide that I'll show. I've conducted, the study over what's seen here is 21 models, but there are actually 9 others, so 30 models in total. All evolved to 20,000 Earth days, which would not at all be possible using a single computer. And so high-powered computing is enabling this type of huge parameter space exploration. And in that, we're able to explore incredibly small forcing size scales to explore how, like, if we perturb the atmosphere of gas giants in specific ways, what type of long-term effects do we observe given certain constraints on the overall behavior of the dynamics. We're able to resolve incredibly small length and time scales with high precision. The evolution timescale of this thing is actually only 4 seconds. So that's what the, so evolving a model at a cadence of 4 seconds for 20,000 days, that's a lot of computation. That's not something that you can just do one at a time. You have to do, large scale HPC. So just to finish up, I'd like to, bring attention to all the great work that's being done at NMSU Astronomy. These are videos courtesy of Dr. Vladimir Lyra. Here we see, magnetohydrodynamics of the protoplanetary disks. So I wanted to highlight the work that's being done on planet formation at NMSU. We also have work being done regarding black hole interaction with supernovae, conducted by another graduate student, Harrison Cook. And of course, there's the planetary atmospheres and thermochemical evolution as being performed by me. So, and there's plenty of other projects that are being done here, such as AI training, neural network generation, and a whole slew of others, including galaxy formation and cosmic evolution of like early universe. So there's great work being done, and it is all enabled by high-powered computing. With that, I think I'll conclude.
Thank you, Ali. That was a wonderful intro on what HPC is, sort of basically, and then going into really cool details. I have questions for you for later. At the moment, though, we're going to move on to our next panelist, Andrew Reineberg, who is a research associate at the University of Colorado Boulder Institute for Behavioral Genetics. Andrew?
All right, so the title of my little talk here is Taking Pictures of the Brain to Learn About Differences in Cognitive Abilities. So on the top right of the slide here is your standard run-of-the-mill MRI scanner that maybe you've encountered in a hospital, for example, if you've ever maybe torn an ACL or broken a bone and the doctor wanted to take a picture of that body part so that they could figure out how to treat it. We use the same kind of technology in my lab to study the brain. And instead of taking pictures of the structure of the brain, the bottom left might be just sort of like what the brain looks like. You can also do certain kinds of imaging of metabolism. So we actually take pictures of oxygen usage in the brain. You can use the same technology to get a picture of where in the brain metabolic activity is happening, which is sort of a proxy for neuronal activity. And we use that kind of imaging to try and understand why some people have higher cognitive abilities and skills than other people. These are constructs, you can just think of them like intelligence. We go into quite a bit of detail about what exactly we're measuring in our papers, but for the purposes of today's talk, you can just sort of imagine we're talking about things like IQ, which is something that more people have heard about, which is a general cognitive ability that relates to quite a bit of things in real life, like life satisfaction, job performance, academic achievement, your likelihood of encountering things like depression and anxiety in your everyday life. So we're interested in learning about the brain so we can try and understand why some people have higher abilities. And in the bottom right, we actually do fairly simple statistical models using scores we calculate from the brain's metabolic activity to predict things like these cognitive abilities. And we're able to predict a pretty good amount of variance in those skills using these brain measures. Now, today's talk is about how I interface with supercomputing, and it's really just a matter of large numbers. Each dot in the bottom right graph is a person, and processing images corresponding to each person's brain takes a long time. So most people don't get a chance to see this kind of data. I just wanted to briefly show a video. This is actually my brain. It's sped up greatly in time, but and I've added false color on top of the anatomical image below it. And this is just sort of showing how there's sort of this reverberant activity that happens in the brain that corresponds to increases and decreases in oxygen usage over time. And a lot of our statistical models sort of integrate over time to get a measure of sort of cumulative activity over time in different parts of the brain. Back in the day, models were quite simple because you might get a single measurement, which we call a voxel of brain activity, just very similar to like a 3D version of a pixel that you would find in just a picture on the internet. sort of back in the day, mainly, you might get one or a few of these measures of the brain. As technology has gotten better over time, these voxels have gotten smaller. Right now, the state of the art is basically you're getting a measure of neuronal activity at a 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter cube of brain cells at a time. So these voxels add up. Now you can kind of think about them in layers across the brain, and finally volumes of the brain. And so we're actually getting these sort of full coverage 3D images of the brain and how it's using oxygen over time, like I showed you in that last video. So this scales up considerably, which is where HPC comes into play here. A single volume right now is this 100 by 100 by 100 matrix of voxels. We acquire these volumes over time. So over the course of an hour, we get about 7,000 of these volumes of data. And then, of course, to learn about how people differ from one another, you need to acquire multiple people. So right now, a standard data set, I'll say, for our lab is about 500 people. However, we're also using some publicly available data sets from the government that have brain images from over 40,000 individuals. Each person's data is, in photography terms, 7.2 gigapixels. So you might have a smartphone that takes a 20 megapixel image. So this is 7.2 thousand megapixels equivalent per person. And that really adds up over time. And basically, because of the nature of the things we do, it's actually quite simple to interface with supercomputing, because you can just send each person's data off to a different machine and process them all in parallel, just like Ali was talking about in the first talk. So it's actually quite simple as far as supercomputing uses go, because we don't have to have communication between different computers. We can just sort of send off different jobs, and each person's data processing might take 24 hours. But if you can do it in parallel, you can process thousands of people per day, which would have taken an unbelievable amount of time in the past. And just to give you a specific example of some of the things that you might need to do to these images on the supercomputer, just a very basic one is using sort of contrast and landmarks to delete the skull, because we want to isolate our processing of data just from the brain itself. So you can see here in this picture, really, we just went in and we removed the skull, and you have to do this in 3 dimensions. You have to do this over time. So it's a lot of repetitive processing of sort of very basic actions. Another thing that we do all the time, because we want to compare one person to another person, is to morph everybody's brain using transformations into the same space. There's basically this entity that regulates what the standard brain is, and we morph everyone's brain into that space, so we can say that this piece of an individual's brain is in the same location as another person. So we get this sort of comparability across individuals. And I don't need to go into the whole lot of details about exactly what I do, but as I said, it's really just this sort of extremely parallelizable workload, where we just send each person's data off to different machines. And the way it works at CU is we have this sort of, it's called a condo cluster, where each lab has bought in one machine or multiple machines. And by buying into this cluster, we get access to everybody else's machines when they're not using them. And so I can send off thousands of jobs at a time and get, in a couple of days, get a result that would have, previously taken months. So, and the unit of analysis for us is usually just the brain volume, or sometimes a whole person's data, depending on how much memory is available at the time. So I think I'll leave it there, and maybe we'll get some questions later. So I'll just say thanks to my lab and the institutions where this work happens.
Thank you, Andrew. Also fascinating. I'm having way too much fun listening to these talks. Next up, we have Colby Berngarn from NMSU Plant and Environmental Sciences, pardon me. Colby.
So I'm an assistant professor of soil science here at NMSU. And here's an image of several soil profiles from around New Mexico State University. And this is just a quick example demonstrating that, for example, in the top photo, the depth from the soil surface to a root limiting layer, which is labeled BKKM, can vary considerably across a landscape. And we know that soils vary significantly across the landscape. So there's been a lot of effort for over 100 years to produce maps of select soil properties for use in land use and management. And my research uses digital soil mapping to try and make high resolution spatial predictions of soil properties at multiple depths. An example of what that would look like is this image. This is a predictive map of soil sand content across the continental United States. Actually, it's North America. And this image was made at actually at 250 meter spatial resolution. So each pixel in this image is 250 meters by 250 meters. And I'm currently part of a project where we're trying to take this same approach down to 30 meters. So each pixel would be 30 meters by 30 meters on the ground, a much higher resolution. And in order to make this happen, in order to produce these results, these maps, I have to generate a large suite of environmental variables. Most of these environmental variables are derived from a digital elevation model, which is just a big grid of numbers where each number corresponds to an elevation, like a number of meters above sea level. And I'm showing here just two variables. For example, slope, which would be the angle of the land surface, for example, in degrees, is an example of one of these terrain derivatives, one of these variables that I can derive from a digital elevation model. Another is this idea of potential solar radiation, how much radiation or how much energy potentially could be received at each one of those pixels. And at a sort of mesoscale, it's quite possible to do this just with a regular workstation. But moving to the continental scale quickly exceeds the availability, the computational feasibility of simply just using even a nice workstation. But we still have to have these variables for large-scale mapping. So my solution was simply to tile that base data set, that base digital elevation model, that base grid of numbers into watersheds. And then for each watershed, I calculated variables for each tile, for each watershed, and I did that on Discovery on NMSU's high performance computing cluster. And so I generated 40 variables, each with multiple parameters. So that resulted in 199 layers. And then I mosaicked all of these back into a seamless product that covered the continental US. That stage is still ongoing. And this resulted in a 13 terabyte data set, even when the images were compressed. So here's just the map of showing these watersheds. This is a standard product from the US Geological Survey of watersheds. And they have different resolutions, some bigger, some smaller. But at this resolution this size of watershed was a good trade-off between computational flexibility and data management. So there's a little bit 330 of these watersheds, and I think there was actually 336 of these watersheds across the US that extended into Canada and Mexico as well. And these were the base DEMs, or the base tiles I used to subset the digital elevation model. And because I was applying the same calculations to every single one of these tiles, it made it very easy to parallelize. I could essentially send each one of these tiles off to its own computer and let it calculate and then send the data back, and I could stick it all back together. And so ideally, each watershed would be processed as a job. Unfortunately, those 336 jobs would exceed Discovery kind of resources and current limits. And so working with Nicholas von Wolf at NMSU's HPC team, he helped me design the following. And I have to say, one of the things that's been the absolutely critical for me in this whole process was working closely with somebody on an HPC cluster. I'm a soil scientist and I get the basics of HPC, but really I just want the results from the science so I can go on and do what I want. So working with somebody who understood HPC has really saved me significant time. I'm very grateful for Nick's help. And so what he helped me, what we kind of came up with is we took those 330 watersheds and grouped them into 18 groups. So we submitted each group as a job, and then I ran 10 of these jobs at a time using the backfill partition. And each one of these jobs iterated over all of the watersheds in a single group. I ran 4 of these tasks in parallel. So each job was running 4 tasks, and I manually balanced the calculations so that each task would take about the same amount of time. Each task used 24 CPUs, 24 threads. This process is mostly processor bound, not memory bound. And so the more processors, the more horsepower I can have, the faster this goes. Each watershed, the calculation took between a few hours and 4 days. Some of those groups exceeded 14 days, which is NMSU's calculation limit. So I just repeated until all of these 18 groups were finished. And total time, that took about a month of wall clock time processing. And I wish I had a prettier picture to show. But really, the benefits from using the high performance computing were first simply that it allowed me to calculate all of these terrain variables at a continental scale. And I have plans to go to then like North and South America, maybe a global scale eventually. Because this, as Diana mentioned, these types of tools allow investigators to answer other questions. It's really improved the efficiency. So I no longer have to calculate these same variables anytime I go someplace else to start another project. Anywhere in the continental US. And it's allowed me to compare results between studies, so I'm sure that the variables are standardized. And so I found HPC to be quite useful for generating bigger questions, data sets that I can use to answer bigger questions. And I'm now looking at collaborative relationships with colleagues in Mexico at the Mexican Geological Survey. And looking at several other questions that now we can answer with this larger data set. So I'll end just with a picture of a soil and say thank you.
Thank you, Colby. And a special thank you for the plug for the NMSU HPC team. The last 2 minutes of this panel are going to be spent talking about resources and specifically the humans that are around to support you on the various systems that you have access to. With that, I will lead into Diego Garcia, who comes to us from the University of Colorado Boulder, Leeds School of Business.
All right, so I'm going to give a quick overview of my research. So I'm a dismal scientist, which stands for an economist, which we're a rare breed social scientists in general when using high performance computing. Let me just give you a little bit of background. I've been using high performance computing now for a couple of decades. I'm a financial economist, so I've been doing a lot of stuff on the financial media, Wall Street Journal, say, and asset prices. Starting with images from the newspapers. If I think about raw data that has come online since I got my PhD in 2000, clearly these digital newspapers has been a great addition. We have New York Times, Wall Street Journal going back all the way to the 19th century. I've done actually a project as players that I'm actually briefly touch upon. But what I wanted to focus and just give you a sense of what we're doing is trying to digitize a bunch of accounting and financial data from historical manuals. Again, one of these new data sets that we have available is that nowadays we can take high resolution pictures of pretty much anything. And this is what my team has been doing over the last few years. And you'll see in a minute, I'm going to try to share a few of these images, what are the nuances involved with this. This is actually very much related to what Andrew was talking about, working with images. Let's talk as well. And probably share a lot of the same sort of tricks along the way. So How do we work with images? Well, in particular, we're thinking about images from a newspaper. What we want to do is just to be able to read it, to get at the words that are in those images. And one can do that using what is called optical character recognition. You may have heard of this. Adobe Acrobat, some of these do it. Pretty lousy job, but they actually do it. And all you do is you just feed the image and try to tell us what it says. When I claim that for newspapers articles, it's pretty easy, very homogeneous corpora, but it is much more nuanced for more complicated types of objects. Why do we need to have these HPCs? Well, if I want to do OCR in a single image, I can probably do it in my laptop. It's going to take 1 or 2 minutes, depending on how big the image is, how complicated. That's fine. The problem is that we have, for one of the projects, 80 manuals. Each of them has 3,000 pages. Let's call that 250,000. And if you start doing the math, that's at least 1 or 2 months. It turns out that you do need to do the OCR multiple times. So if we were to do this on a single computer, it would easily take a few years. I got a couple of papers doing this type of techniques. One is counting negative and positive words in articles. I'll show you a sample of that. I'm going to claim that that was pretty easy. This I did about a decade ago. We have a working paper now with this bigger ask of trying to digitize this accounting and financial database, in which we figure out who the board of directors of firms are right before the Great Depression and see how these firms did during the Great Depression. So let me very briefly show you here some of the output. So this is a column called Topics in Wall Street that got published in the Wall Street Journal for a long time. The original data was actually an image, and I have the image somewhere over here. This is the image that we had. And if you feed this image to an engine, you actually can get some decent text. You can read this, and just there is some garbage that the computer cannot read. It really struggles with fractions and numbers. But if one was to get at positive and negative words, this was actually pretty good. We worked fairly well. These are some images from these Moody's manuals that have this fantastic data set of financial and accounting information. It gives you information on the history of the firm, who are the managers, who are the officers, who are the directors, even tells you balance sheet information. Not quite sure if this is more or less complicated than a brain, but it's certainly up there, very heterogeneous. So they were just thinking about how to clean, where there's a lot of cleaning here in terms of the tags and ads that the thing has, and so on and so forth. Now, what is the final goal? Well, the final goal is to take it, get the OCR output from this. And here you can see one company called Acme Steel. And you can see that, we read it as a human. This is pretty straightforward. There are some problems here with Illinois being read as 111, but this can be put into a database format. So we have here Acme Steel, who were the directors of that firm, where were they located? And then we can think about how these firms were connected right before the Great Depression, which is what this paper is about. So going from this complicated image, try to put it into a database format in which then we can just run regressions if you wish. I will mention the chess project was very similar, in the sense that we wanted to figure out when people were making mistakes playing chess, and all you have to do is just, nowadays the best chess player in the world is a computer, obviously. Maybe not obviously, but I'm telling you that I'm a chess player. So figuring out when people do make mistakes is pretty easy. 5 seconds in a computer will tell you most human mistakes. And the problem is that if you have 10 million games, and each game has about 80 moves between the two players, then it's the only way to do it is if you parallel it. So just a couple of anecdotes to finish up. The first time that I did this OCR was around 2007. I actually bought a computer, a cheap computer, and that computer, the only thing that I did was the OCR. And that was not bad practices, but it was a little bit tricky to actually get the OCR engine to run in the cluster. I actually figure out how to do that here at Boulder, which is where I'm currently located. I will highlight the fact that even if you're a postdoc, I'm thinking, well, I'm going to move universities and then things are going to be different. I've been using clusters of Berkeley, Carolina, Dartmouth, and Boulder, and they're all about the same. Boulder is definitely a pretty good cluster that we have. And these things take time, 100,000 CPU hours is a lower bound in the project that we're doing right now, but it can be done. You parallelly just wait around for a month, whatever it takes, and it works. And let me just highlight the fact that I do a lot of natural language processing with these images. Once you have the text, you've got to process it in different ways. And that is not so time consuming. Reading the image is much more time consuming. But very often these things can take 20, 30 hours. And having access to these supercomputers means you can parallel it and get it done in 1 or 2 hours, or even 30 minutes when you create your own protocols. And I really mean this. I love the Boulder Summit supercomputer.
Sorry, I'm over here grinning and laughing at the enthusiasm for the computers themselves. You grow emotionally attached to the resources. I don't know why, but I think everybody kind of does. And I'm loving that energy. Thank you, Diego. Our next panelist is Joel Sharbrough from New Mexico Tech, the biology department.
Hello, everyone. All right, so my name is Joel Sharbrough. I am an assistant professor at New Mexico Tech. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is how we use HPC in the classroom to sort of perform project learning based educational activities and teach people how to use HPC. And specifically, in this case, I'm going to tell you about our sort of first iteration of this, where we looked for patterns of ancient hybridization in Neanderthal genomes, which was pretty fun. So like with Diana, I am a evolutionary biologist, plant geneticist, and what has changed fundamentally in our field is DNA sequencing. It is a true revolution. So sort of starting with the human genome, you get this massive injection of funds from the federal government, resulting in the development of just astounding technologies and the ability to produce amazing amounts of DNA sequence data in very little time. And so what I'm showing on the left here is a graph through time, and I want you to pay attention sort of to the red curve of the number of nucleotides deposited in our public database called GenBank over the last few years. And of course, until the human genome was published, we didn't get much at all. And then all of a sudden it just skyrockets. And notice this is on a log scale. So this is just a massive increase of DNA sequencing data. And I checked it today, and we're actually up to around 14 trillion nucleotides inside the GenBank database. So this it's just a massive amount of data. We're drowning in data. We have not enough people, not enough resources to possibly analyze this in a single human lifetime unless we use high performance computing. And in particular, we need to get some more people involved in order to do the high performance computing. So we need to train them, and their training can, give them careers as lowly assistant professors, or often these awesome biotech companies that are spinning off left and right. And so the more people we can train in HPC usage, the more we're going to be able to analyze this data and learn things about the natural world. So that's sort of where I enter in today, is to tell you about how we've gone about training folks in HPC so far. So I teach a bioinformatics class at New Mexico Tech, and essentially the course is separated into two parts. The first part is learning how to do low throughput, accurate by hand analyses of biological data. And then the second half is using the Discovery cluster to scale up and process these data sets that are the size that you could never analyze by hand in a single human lifetime. So these massive DNA sequencing data sets. And so overall, there's sort of three main components to getting students to really work with the HPC nicely. The first I found to be really effective is giving the students an interesting challenge choice. So many of us who have taken bioinformatics, our course in bioinformatics was extremely boring and basically a lesson in clicking around to different websites and saying, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. But that's not how the scientific process works, right? We have hypotheses, we want to go and test them, we want to analyze data to understand the nature of the universe better. And so the key here was inputting that same idea into our students. So giving them a challenge, a problem, and a choice. And so in this class, I gave them 3 choices. They chose the Neanderthal project to investigate. Second, and this was the most challenging for me, is to break down the project into manageable chunks so that our students can handle it. And so what we do is basically separate the overall pipeline or algorithm into manageable chunks, essentially single homework assignments across weeks. And then secondly is we have to break the data up a little bit to make it manageable for individual students. And so we break the data across students, and ideally we replicate it. So multiple students are working either on the same data set or a data set from the same biological sample, something like that. So you got to break it into chunks. And then finally, this is sort of on the back end, you need a combination of writing and presentations to force the students to digest what they've done. You know, they can press the buttons all they want, but actually getting engagement and learning those skills for retention, you need to process it mentally. And so the best thing that we can do is just do writing assignments and presentations about what they've done, what computational activities they undertook. So let me tell you about this project. It's actually really cool. So in addition to the overall biological revolution in DNA sequencing, we've also seen really cool advances in sequencing ancient DNA. And so now we're doing Jurassic Park style stuff on genomes, to the extent that we've sequenced a bunch of ancient hominin genomes. And so here I'm showing an evolutionary tree that depicts the relationships between humans and our extinct cousins, the Neanderthals, which you've probably heard of. But a more recent discovery has been a new species called the Denisovans. And we don't really know anything about the Denisovans other than where they were, which is somewhere mostly in Siberia. And we have their entire DNA sequence, which is absolutely crazy to be able to know this much about an extinct species from which we have a couple of teeth, right? So we've sequenced this genome, and not me personally, all these wonderful scientists sequenced this genome and showed that Denisovans are actually pretty closely related to Neanderthals and separate from humans, and they're sort of both distantly related to humans. And this is their nuclear DNA, the DNA, you know, your 23 chromosomes. However, all eukaryotes have more than just their nuclear DNA. We also have DNA in our mitochondria, and the mitochondria tell a very different story. And let me tell you a little bit about that story. So it started with this discovery of Cima de los Huesos, which is Spanish for the pit of bones, where we found a bunch of these awesome bones, you know, that are really nicely stratified across time. So we can date the layer of fossils in this cave, this pit. And it goes basically like, you know, humans from 20,000 years ago, and then there's cave bears, a layer of cave bears, and then there's a layer of humans from older, and then another layer of cave bears, and then even deeper you get a layer of Neanderthals, and then another layer of cave bears. There's a lot of switching off in this cave between cave bears and hominids. And deep down in there, they found a fossil that we call now the Cima de los Huesos fossil. And it looks like a Neanderthal skull. Phenotypically, it looks like a Neanderthal. It's about 400,000 years old. However, when we sequenced its genome, we saw a different story, namely that this individual in its mitochondrial DNA was more closely related to Denisovans. And what's more is that the Neanderthals in this, when you sequence your mitochondrial DNA, are more closely related to humans than they are to Denisovans. So this is a different story than what we got with the whole nuclear genome. So this is called mitonuclear discordance. When this happens, essentially you get different evolutionary relationships depending on which cellular genome you use. Whether if you use the nuclear DNA, you get this evolutionary relationships where Neanderthals, Cima de los Huesos, and Denisovans are closely related. But if you look in the mitochondrial DNA, you get a sister relationship between Neanderthals and humans. So this is where our story starts. And the question is, how did this discrepancy in evolutionary histories come to be? And one of the primary hypotheses is that there was a mitochondrial replacement in which Neanderthals residing in Europe mated with some human-like individual, not a human, but human-like, and that they took their mitochondrial DNA, and that mitochondrial DNA spread throughout all of Neanderthals to the extent that the ancestral Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA no longer exists, except potentially in this Cima de los Huesos individual. So how do you go and look for this? How do you go and look for this? Well, there is a way, and I'm sorry for the resolution here. I don't know why that's so bad. But there's these mutations called pneumites, and what they are is little pieces of the mitochondrial genome that occasionally migrate in and insert themselves into the nuclear genome and act as a sort of genomic fossil of what the mitochondrial DNA was like on the day that sequence inserted into the nuclear genome. So they're like a little record book through time of what mitochondrial DNA looks like. And so we went searching using the discovery cluster for these nuclear encoded mitochondrial sequences, or pneumites, in Neanderthal genome sequences. And so each individual in the class had a different Neanderthal DNA sequencing data set. Two individuals we replicated it by, there would be two students where they had the same Neanderthal but different DNA sequencing data sets, and go and look for pneumites and see, do the ancient records of mitochondrial sequences look more like the nuclear genome? Lo and behold, we found in every single Neanderthal evidence of an ancient mitochondrial DNA sequence, now present only in the nucleus, but that it looks like the Cima de los Huesos sample. It looks like the Denisovan sample, indicating that we have found a genomic fossil of this ancient hybridization event. And so this was all performed on the discovery cluster. The individual I'm showing here is from the Mezmezkaya cave, which is down here in southern Russia, Georgia area. And so what we can say about this then is that Neanderthal pneumites resemble Denisovan mitochondrial DNA. Thus, an ancient human-like mitochondrial DNA invaded through hybridization and eventually replaced the ancestral Neanderthal mitochondrial genomes. And this implies a novel out of Africa event prior to the evolution of humans that we have no archaeological evidence for. So through this sort of course-based research experience, you could call it, we were able to uncover this new out of Africa event and hybridization between ancient hominids. Okay, so what worked and what didn't work? I think what worked really well was the Discovery HPC is awesome. It's so great. The team was super great with helping us through different tools, and they had it was such a user-friendly experience that the students could sort of dip their toes in. The pipeline worked really well. The final products were really beneficial. The writing project and the presentation were really nice. And it really got the students interested so that they cared about the data that they were analyzing. And I think that that's really key, is that if you care about what the answer is to a question, then you're going to have a better chance learning the technique that you need in order to answer that question. So what we'll be improving hopefully in the spring is we need to dedicate a little bit more time to learning on the command line. I think that's the challenge for students. Going from sort of browser-based analyses to the command line is a little bit of a gap. And then just retaining those skills afterward is what we're going to try and work on next. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you and stay tuned. I'm currently writing up this manuscript, Fossils Within Fossils, Evidence from New Mites for an Ancient Mitochondrial Replacement in Neanderthals. That'll be authored by the entire class. And yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to NMSU and the Discovery HPC team, especially Diana, for their help in getting this up and running. It was just a wonderful joy. So thank you for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Joel. I don't know about you guys, but I can't imagine being in a class as an undergrad and like being an author on a paper because of it. It still just, it blows my mind. And I love that we are getting students excited and interested in doing this, because there's nothing like seeing your name in print to, yeah, there's nothing like seeing your name in print on an article. With that, I'm going to segue into our very last panelist, Sun Lee, who is a PhD student at NMSU inside mechanical and aerospace engineering.
Thank you for introducing me. I'm going to share my screen. So hello, everyone. My name is Sun. I'm going to talk about use of HPC on computational fluid dynamics. As introduced, I'm a PhD student. Actually, I'm a PhD candidate in a mechanical and aerospace engineering department. So in our department, the research mostly involves fluid and thermal material control systems and dynamics. Those are all relevant to mechanical systems, aircraft and rockets, and so on. So what is computational fluid dynamics? We study fluid motions on various geometries and various speed range with computational method. So we mainly solve a set of important equations. Those are continuity, momentum, and energy equation. And actually, those look like this. You know, this is a momentum equation, which is a very important, famous equation. If you can solve this analytically, you can get a $1 million right away at a Clay Mathematical Institute. So yeah, we have to solve these equations on millions of points or cells. We call the simulation. Yeah, we need a really, really big and good computer. So what does exactly the CFD lab do? We have currently 7 ongoing projects in our lab, and 2 of them are supported by NASA and DoD HPC, and rest of them are all running local NMSU local HPC cluster discovery. So I'm gonna introduce some of result of my recent research. The first one is actually shockwave turbulent boundary layer interaction with the corrugated wall. So we set a shockwave impinging on the turbulent boundary layer flowing over a flat plate. This white one is a flat plate, and then this one is shockwave. And the flow separates over here with the separation bubble in the interaction region, this red box. And then from a lot of literature, the unsteady motion near the interaction was confirmed. And we also found that. So the problem is the, I'm sorry. Yeah, so the unsteadiness is regarded to cause deformation of flow structures, vortex shedding, and so on. So we thought, like, what if we can control or remove the unsteadiness? So this motivated us to set up the wall corrugation directly into the interaction to remove the flow structure deformation. So this is the result actually we have. It's an animation. So this colored gummy bear-like things are called as turbulent structures, and then you can see some like black hairy things are fluctuating. This is considered to be associated with the unsteadiness. And then we compared the shock structures for both flat plate and corrugated wall cases. So you can see the shock waves originate from the crest of the corrugation and the trough merged form a reflected shock here. And then also you can see the same wavelength, same wavelength, the spanwise direction for the reflected shock here and also here. So finally, we found that the wall corrugation directly applied to the interaction rather increased the unsteadiness. So we decided to set up some different kind of corrugation. Actually, that case is running on discovery right now. And then that will be published in 2022 June for AIAA Aviation Forum. The second project we are working on is acceleration of CFD code implementation with using GPUs on the OpenCL platform. So our CFD code is based on the CPU, which is actually MPI, and that works pretty stable, but it takes a long time. And then we are trying to build a GPU accelerated hybrid code based on MPI and OpenCL integration. And we plugged the parallelized Thomas algorithm for compact finite difference scheme into our current CFD code. And also we were able to use up to 10 NVIDIA Tesla P100 GPUs that are assigned for our CFD lab partition nodes. Then we already confirmed that the GPU acceleration is 30 to 40 times faster than CPU only operation in our current CFD algorithm. So, and talking about some experience on the Discovery SP cluster. So since the Joker was renovated to Discovery, I could get 3 publications, including 1 journal and 2 conference papers. And actually, this number could look like a little humble, but considering the size of the simulation, I think it's pretty good. And also, including my dissertation, and at least 3 more publications will come out, like the research that I just talked about. And also I could continue my research with minimal major government computation resource like DOD or NASA HPCs. So for 2 more years of use, I could get 300 more processors, and approximately I consumed like 40 million computation hour. So I also, lastly, I really want to say thank you to ICT Center HPC team. They helped a lot. So this is what I have for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sun. I wanted to open up the floor and see if anybody had any questions for our panelists. All right, well, with that, I'm going to ask my own. So given that everybody here has differing amounts of experience with the HPC, right? Some have been using it for decades, some of it have been using it for the past several years for graduate work. What advice would you have for somebody who is thinking about how to get into HPC, supercomputing, high performance computing, right? Sometimes the terms themselves, the names we use, are intimidating. So how would you suggest somebody try to get into this area?
Well, I can sort of give my own sort of thoughts. Really, you've got to have something that requires you to think about how much time this is going to take you to deal with, right? Like if you have some problem that you just are not going to be able to solve during graduate school, you know, if you want to ever get a degree, then you have to solve this problem with some more efficient or some more parallelizable equipment or approach. So I think that's the key, is giving people a challenge that is just not solvable by hand or not solvable by just looking at it. And And at that point, then you can start to say, okay, what is available, what's out there? So that's my starting point.
I'll give you my quick 2 cents before heading off at the end to my next meeting. So I think, you know, it's like everything, practice makes perfect. It's not really that hard to use, you know, a supercomputer. It's just a Linux system, and, you know, it may take a few hours to figure it out. The one piece of advice that I have for anybody trying to do this is to talk to the system administrators. I think one of the panelists actually mentioned in the talk, have office hours with them a few times a month. They're happy to talk to the researchers to make sure that we're using the clusters appropriately. I've been using, as I said, a bunch of classes already. I've been doing this for 20 years. And when I moved to Boulder, I made sure that I spent a couple of weeks knowing the names of everybody that was in the research computing team, and seeing how protocols were actually a little bit different than in other places that I had been. And, you know, one of the biggest challenges when using a new tool, and a high performance computer is a new tool, is, you know, you need to do the debugging and so on. But these system administrators, in my experience, have been extremely useful through the years.
Thank you, Diego. To sort of bounce off of that comment, and I think it was Colby who said it, right? The HPC is a tool. And so I just wanted to ask, right, how many people feel like they get into the weeds when it comes to the HPC, right? Meaning having to get down into the nitty-gritty coding of things versus being able to run software that might make life a little bit easier. Do you find yourself coding a whole lot, or does it appear to be field specific?
So I wrote, when I was doing this, I made the choice, and maybe it was a mistake, to write everything in Bash. So I didn't use, I didn't use Python or R or anything. I wrote it just sort of natively, as simply as I could. And so I did spend a lot of time completely lost in the weeds. That's why I needed a lot of help. But I also needed a lot of help from just sort of thinking about the process. What was the most efficient way to divide up the data, to process on it? Because there was multiple ways. And so having somebody to talk through and saying, if I process, where do I parallelize? And so I think, yeah, I did get lost in the weeds a lot, but having somebody to help me work through that was important, but maybe actually having somebody to help me think through about how to actually parallelize the task and think about it was as important.
I can add my perspective. I started off doing a lot of things by hand, and recently, in our field at least, there's been this huge effort to increase the reproducibility of our research for other people. And so there's a very strong preference right now for using existing tools if possible to do things. So right now, I really only need to write my own code when I'm trying to invent some new concept or analysis idea. And I find that the bulk of what I do is using other people's code and just having to parallelize it, which is much easier than having to write my own. And I think that the benefits of that is, like I said, it's easier for people to reproduce our pipelines when I'm using a tool that's just downloadable, or it's a Python package that other people have sort of validated. So I think you can go both ways, but you don't have to, at least in our field.
Ali, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, generally, with high power computing, sometimes you end up using codes as black boxes, and that kind of hinders, beginners' ability to learn what it actually is. And so I think one of the more important aspects of it is, making a choice to get down into the weeds yourself and really understanding the mechanics of it, because it isn't straightforward. It isn't hard, but it isn't exactly, something that just comes naturally to you, because we don't really think that way. So, it's important sometimes, I think, at least, to have some form of contribution to the code and some form of experience where you have to spend time parallelizing it and understanding the code in response to whatever cluster you're using. So, I mean, in my experience, I've done both. I've used codes as black boxes just because I sort of understood which cluster I was using, how it was parallelized. But, when it came down to doing my own research, it was a lot more useful to write the hydrodynamics code from scratch.
Those are both great points. I think the majority of the time that I'm writing code is really moving between different modules of programs, because a lot of times you'll employ the same tool in a very different context than what it was designed for and that sort of thing. So you need to be in the weeds to be able to translate that tool into what you want to get out of it and move it into your next module. And so the modules are sort of replaceable. You could, go, I'll speak in genome terms here of like mapping your reads and then counting up how highly expressed a gene is. You can do that with a bunch of different tools, put together in some order. And so you have to move your data set through that pipeline and in probably a different way than other people have done before. So that's where you need to be in the weeds to be able to understand the output from certain modules and the input, what you need to transform it to get it to work in the next module. But the actual analysis, like the actual programs that go into that pipeline or whatever, they're, like Andrew said, reproducible, and everybody knows what to expect out of them, which is really nice. So a combo there of like not too much building new things, but just being able to understand what went into that, that widely used sort of thing.
I want to give the audience a moment to ask their questions. If this conversation has caused you to think of any. If not, then I will go ahead and pop over into our very last 2-minute slides and just sort of give you a quick presentation on HPC and you. So as somebody who got this email, right, was notified of this panel, you are located within an organization that has access to these systems. So there are 3 main ones we're going to talk about today: Discovery, which is located at NMSU; Summit, which is located at the University of Colorado at Boulder; and Exceed, which is a national resource. So Discovery, again, located at NMSU, received a grant last year opening up 10 nodes, both CPU and GPU, so for graphical modeling or standard computing for classrooms specifically, which is how Joel's class ended up on Discovery. The website is there, and we have both command line access and website access to the system. Summit is the system that is at University of Colorado at Boulder. You've heard several people discuss that today as well. And in order to access that system, you have to be a part of an institution that is a part of RMAC, so the Rocky Mountain Advanced Computing Consortium. Your university is most likely a part of this. If it isn't, come talk to RMAC. We would be more than happy to welcome you into this partnership. As a sister organization, you have access to Summit as well, and that is great for both research and some classroom activities as well. Exceed is a system of system of national resources that are housed in different locations. Somebody mentioned TAC and Stampede earlier today. That's the system located at UT Austin. We also have a wide variety of them, some of which are really GPU, so modeling heavy. So you can have access to tens of thousands of those. Or, for example, for Joel and me for the bioinformatics, Sometimes we need to read in large data files into memory. I like to do transcriptomics, and that doesn't work if you don't have all the parts to play with. It's like trying to put it together a puzzle that's 1,000 pieces doing 100 pieces at a time, right? It's never going to work. So there's a system that you can access through Exceed that allows you to read in up to 20 terabytes of stuff, whatever your favorite stuff is, into memory. And each one of these systems is free to use, right? So you don't have to have oodles of grant funding in order to get access to any of these systems. The best part of all of these systems is that there are humans on the flip side to help you. So I think every single panelist today has given a shout out to somebody that they talked to at their particular facility of choice that gave them some kind of support. And so here is a quick list of contacts for each of those. So Discovery has the HPC team. It's a group of graduate students, the administrators, and myself here to support you in the very basics of how to run a job to how do we make your job run more effectively. Summit has the research computing help, and they have help tickets that you can place. They'll contact you and they are happy to offer you the same kind of support that the HPC team does at NMSU. Exceed has humans called campus champions that are located across a variety of institutions. I believe we have hit over 300 of them, and we have thousands of campus champions. These humans are specifically located on these campuses to help people learn how to navigate through these national resources, right? Which resource is best for your particular research, right? What you're trying to accomplish, and how do you get onto these systems, right? Discovery, you just simply ask and we'll let you in. Summit, there's a quick one-page blurb you write, and then you get an allocation. For Exceed, it's also an allocation request that requires a little bit more details. And for each one of these types of requests, these groups are here to help. So with that, I wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists for coming and joining us today. I got really carried away with listening to everybody talk about their research, and it makes me miss being in grad school and listening to all of these cool interdisciplinary talks, right? I feel like the further out you are from grad school, the more sort of specialized you become. And I really enjoy these interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary kinds of conversations, because you start thinking about who you might be able to talk to and what you might be able to do with the resources, with the knowledge that you have, and making those connections. So thank you very much, each one of our panelists. And thank you to all of the attendees as well. We appreciate your time. I know we ran over by a little bit, but we really appreciate you sticking around to the very end. Thank you all.